Good evening. My name is Marjorie Gans, and I'm a member of the board of the Writers' Room of Boston. I'm delighted that you could join us tonight for this September reading of Readings from the Room, our reading series. We started this virtual series in September, back in the summer, actually in March of 2021. For anyone new to us, the Writers' Room of Boston is a co-working space in downtown Boston for any and all writers, both established and people who are emerging, but really anybody who's writing, who wants a peaceful, quiet place to come and work in the company of other writers. The room is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it provides desks, and it provides silence and the quiet companionship of other writers. We've been serving the writers of the greater Boston area since 1993. Please contact us if you're curious or you have any questions, and you can check out our posts on both the Instagram and the Facebook page of Writers of Boston. We also have a newly designed website, which has information. It also has recordings of our previous readings, and it will have the recording of this reading as well, and photos, so you can see what the inside of the room looks like and some of what the view from the room looks like. So we would be delighted to have new members. We have different levels of membership. We have ones where you can come into the room and other virtual memberships. And if you're interested, please contact our program director, Leslie Ostro, at info@writersroomofboston.org. So in 2021, we launched this new reading series as a way to reach out to the writing community during the pandemic. We wanted to share the wonderful writing from both established and emerging writers. And some of the readers have called the Writers' Room home, and some have been from all different parts of the country, which has been possible because of the remote connection. Tonight we have Leanna Olbinsky, who's a memoir writer, and Karen Winn, a fiction writer. As we go along tonight, feel free to use the question and answer feature in the box at the bottom of the screen. You can type your questions in there, and when you do, I'll see them, and at the end of the reading, we'll come back and have a question and answer time. The series is made possible from grants from the Mass Cultural Council and the Boston Cultural Council. We also rely on friends. So if you enjoy this program, please consider making a contribution by using the donate button at the bottom of your screen. We will also be recording this reading, and a replay, as I said, will be available on the website. First, Leanna Olbinsky is an experienced blogger and writer. She grew up in a family that struggled with addiction and draws inspiration from her experiences. Leanna is an aspiring author, and her goal is to share her and her father's story about how to overcome disappointment and find peace and hope through the ups and downs. She now writes a blog, Rising Hope, where she offers help for others like herself and helps people to find confidence and forgiveness for the loved ones who struggle with addictions, and sometimes for oneself. Leanna has worked over 10 years in app startups and manages the Rising Hope Foundation on the side. She lives in Medford, Massachusetts, and enjoys reading, cooking, or taking walks along the river. And she is looking forward to her memoir, from which she will read tonight, being published. That date will appear on her website as soon as she knows. So Leanna, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. My book is not ready for release yet, as stated by Marjorie, but you can go to my website, risinghope.co, and subscribe to my newsletter to get updates. The chapter I'm going to be reading today or tonight is from my book. It's based on a dark time when I was 24 and my dad had been out of prison for 5 months. So that's just a little background there, and I'll jump in. It's funny how when we don't have a car, we feel as though we lose our freedom. The loss can vary depending on our distance from the city. For a town like the one I grew up in, it's a hard loss. Later on in life, when my house in Carver was vacant and I needed to take a taxi from the train to my house, it cost over $300 and it was less than a 4-mile ride. Any store you want to walk to is at least a mile away. On March 11th, my dad sent me a text. "Good morning, my love. How are you today? I think you need daddy's hug. I wanted to go to the mall. Do you want to go with me?" I was still finishing up work and I texted him how much I loved him. My dad didn't respond back. A few days later, I arrived at the restaurant where I had waitressed. I wasn't serving tables though. I was there to help the owner of the restaurant craft his menu for a new restaurant he was opening down the street. I checked my dad's location while I was waiting for the owner to get there. Something made me check my dad's location that night. I'm not quite sure what. I didn't always check where he was, but sometimes on occasion I was curious. He still hadn't answered my text from the other day. Maybe that sparked my interest. I pulled up my dad's location. My heart sank. My dad was in New Bedford, in the same town where he was sentenced to serve 5 years in prison. There wasn't anything good for him in that town. I immediately sat up in alert. I zoomed in on the location as if I were looking for something to justify why he was there at 9:30 p.m. I zoomed in until I could practically see in the house he was at. My thoughts raced. Should I call the cops? Should I call my dad? Should I tell someone? No. There was nothing I could do. Besides, what would I possibly tell the cops anyways? That I suspected my dad was in the house where people were using drugs? No, no chance, too big of a risk. No chance my dad was going back to prison because of me. And if I called my dad instead, what would I say? I couldn't let him know I knew where he was. To him, that would be a betrayal and a reveal of how little I may have trusted him. And my mom, if I told my mom, she'd instantly tell my dad I was tracking him. That would be even worse because he and my dad weren't on good terms. The plan for her to move out were becoming more and more solidified. I didn't want to cause a further divide. I wanted him to leave that place. I wanted to check his locations in 5 minutes and see that he was on a highway going home. I put my poker face back on and got ready for my meeting. It was an important meeting for me because this was the man who helped me get my first apartment, and now he was trusting me to help him with his new restaurant. This was also an awesome opportunity for my career too. I'd add website and menu design to my portfolio for an inevitably successful restaurant on one of the busiest streets in Boston. I wanted to be as professional as possible. The meeting went on until 11 p.m. I was focused, but as soon as we shook hands and parted ways, I checked my phone. I was hoping to see his location marked as safe and sound at home. My heart dropped and I gasped for air. My dad's location now showed he was at the hospital. I started to hyperventilate. I felt like I was being suffocated. I stood up lightheaded and started walking down the street to my apartment. What if he was dead? What if I just witnessed my dad die and I did nothing to stop it? I could have called him. I could have called the cops. I could have told someone. The last thing I wanted to do was go home and sit in my room alone and indulge in horrible thoughts. I didn't want to be alone, even if I was surrounded by strangers. I went to a bar down the street, R2. R2 used to be my favorite place to go after a long shift at the restaurant. It was intimate with dark mood lighting and large leather wingback bar chairs. It was a local hangout where you could get away with talking to others or keeping to yourself. I was the only one there, so I sat in the middle of the bar in front of a beautiful painting. I ordered a glass of wine so I wouldn't be rude for not ordering anything, but I didn't touch it. I sat and sipped on the water while I stared at the painting in front of me. I thought about how different my life would be if my dad was dead. It was something that his drug addiction forced me to think about a lot. Ever since I found out that my dad had overdosed 4 times, I knew he'd already gained 4 additional chances at life. One of my friends from the neighborhood came in and sat next to me. Usually, I could chat up a storm and I could talk about anything. But right then, I barely wanted to say, "How are you doing?" because I didn't want the question to be reciprocated. Luckily, my friend didn't care much about small talk or pleasing other people, which was quite refreshing at the moment. All I had to say was I had received bad news and I didn't want to go home. He didn't pry. We talked briefly and we sat in each other's silence while appreciating each other being there. I left at 12:30 in the morning when the bar was just starting to fill up. I offered my full wine to my friend, and once he accepted, I decided it was time to walk home. At home, I dragged myself in the bathroom to get ready for bed. Once I was in bed, I couldn't shut my eyes to go to sleep. My dad was dead. My dad was dead. It was all I could think to myself. I thought about when I would get the call with the news and whether the hospital would call me or if it'd be my grandpa or my mom. I thought about whether I could get the homeowners of where he was that night arrested and if that would bring me any solace at all. I kept the screenshots of the location just in case. I grabbed my phone and I started to scroll through social media. No, what am I doing? Don't numb this feeling. I tried to put my phone away. I kept it by my side and I kept my eyes wide open in the dark. After some time had passed, something sparked an idea. I jumped out of bed and I opened my laptop. I searched the hospital my dad was at. I dialed the number. Hi, I think my dad is at this hospital. Can you check for me? His name is Leanna Olbinsky. Yes, he was just released. My dad is alive, I thought. I paused. Can you tell me why he was there? No, we cannot disclose patient information. Thank you, I said. I was used to hearing this on the numerous accounts of my dad being in and out of the hospital at this point. Tears fell and the exhaustion hit me like a ton of bricks, and I was finally able to sleep. But first, I sent a text to my dad. I love you. No matter why he ended up at the hospital that night, I loved him. It didn't matter what happened. It only mattered that he was okay. I texted him that night, love you, Dad. The next day, I texted him again. Hi, Dad, I miss you. The day after that, I texted him again, thinking about how unbearable the guilt must have felt. I texted him the next day. Hi, Dad, I love you no matter what. You're my best friend. Finally, 6 days later, my dad texted me back. Good morning, my love. I'm very depressed. I got into a car accident. I'm so sorry I've not called you. I'm just staying home in bed for now. I love you, my baby. Baby, I love you more than anything, and I don't have a lot of support. I can't handle it anymore. Thank God I have you. I love you. I texted back, that's okay, Daddy, as long as you're okay, I'm here for you. It's a gift you're still in my life, and I'm not letting that ever change. Every moment is another chance to do better, and you have someone here that will never forget who you really are. I know who you are. You have a huge heart, and your intentions are good. He texted back 2 days later. I'm so sorry for everything, all the tears that I caused you, all the sleepless nights, all the shame and embarrassment. You deserve a lot better, Father. Please forgive me. I love you always. I imagine the next thing he did was use drugs. I wasn't sure anymore what his form of injection was. He wanted to die. I don't believe he would kill himself, but he could have decided not to monitor the amount he was taking. The next day I heard from him was the 21st of March. The conversation went on as normal. So, as if there were no major lapse in time or acknowledgement of the damage. That's how it had to be with my dad's fragile state of mind. He knew when he screwed up. I let things carry on normally with the gentle reminders that I was there for him. He knew that meant I'd be there for him when he needed love, and he needed love. My dad didn't have a job, and now he didn't have a car in a town where your freedom is based on having a car. That is all. Thank you.
Sorry, that took a minute. Thank you, Leanna. That was a lot to take in, and it was really wonderful. Yeah. So our next reader, next we have Karen Winn, and Karen was a board member of the Writers' Room and has come back to us to read. She received her MFA from Fairleigh Dickinson University and also holds a doctorate degree in nursing. Karen has published short stories and essays in Hippocampus, LitHub, Writer's Digest, and elsewhere. And her work has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize. She was born and raised in New Jersey in a small town not unlike the fictional Hammond, where her debut novel, Our Little Word, takes place. Karen now lives here in Boston with her husband, 2 children, and a Bernedoodle. She's reading from her novel, which came out in May and is available wherever you buy books. Karen, go ahead. You're muted, Karen.
I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. Start from the beginning.
Thank you so much, Marjorie, Leslie, and Leanna. I'm reading from my debut novel, Our Little World. So set in the 1980s in a small idyllic New Jersey town, this book follows two young sisters whose relationship fractures when a neighborhood girl goes missing. It's a coming of age story with a looming mystery. And the passage I'm going to read begins on page 18. To give you a little background info, it's 1985 and it's been raining for a week. Finally, the sun's come out, and my protagonist, B, a rising 7th grader, is excited to go swimming at the local lake with her sister Audrina and the two new neighborhood kids who just moved from Boston to New Jersey, cute Max and his little 4-year-old sister, Sally. Mrs. Baker, Max and Sally's mom, is the one who is going to take the group to the lake. And the only other piece of information you need to know is that B, my protagonist, is a little upset with her sister, Audrina, as her sister has just given Sally, this new neighborhood girl, her charm bracelet, and it's a bracelet that B herself has always coveted. It took about 15 minutes to get to Deer Chase Lake from our houses. Main Street eventually turned into Route 108, from which spit the turnoff for the lake's small dirt parking lot. The lake was located upon a hill, and it had a sandy beach, a fact I found ironic since the lake was as still as pool water, not at all like the ocean. But surrounding the lake were dense woods, the trees so tall and busy, I'd once had the thought as I stood on the lake's perimeter that the lake itself was a sort of beach for the vast woods that crowned it. It was the kind of forest that seemed to hold secrets that made you a bit dizzy if looked at too closely or too long. As soon as Mrs. Baker's station wagon chugged up to Deer Chase Lake, we could tell it was crowded because there were no more open spots in the parking lot. Cars had now begun to line the road. Mrs. Baker pulled up behind the last parked car, and we tumbled out to race up the stairs that led to the lake. As we neared the top, somber sounds circled us like a swarm of bees. Children screaming and laughing, water being splashed, dogs barking, a cautionary 2-whistle beep from the lifeguard stand. I looked out to the lake, which appeared like a giant, nearly too full bowl of water. People bobbed up and down, their bodies in constant motion. Kids raced in and out of the lake, chasing one another. In the far distance, I saw 2 people swimming back toward the beach. They were much farther out than everyone else. That must have been the reason for the whistle blow. The beach was shortened because of the recent storm, but we still managed to find a good spot not too far from the water. Mrs. Baker flung open her chair and angled it toward the sun, which meant facing a section of the woods. She plopped down without stripping to her bathing suit and began fanning herself with her book. "Go ahead and play, kiddos. Keep an eye on your sister, Max." I was secretly hoping Mrs. Baker would remove her cover up so I could see the way she looked in her bathing suit. Sometimes when it got really, really hot, she cooled off with a brief swim, though most of the time she was content to lounge in one of her colorful cover-ups, some of which looked more like fancy bathrobes than swimwear. She loved sunning herself, and I recently noticed that the inside of her arm, where the extra skin rolled over, was whiter than the rest of it. It was like the skin underneath my bathing suit where the sun didn't hit. Sally, that's Max's little sister, Sally began building a sandcastle, and Audrina, that's B's sister, took off toward the lake without me, while Max, after a brief hesitation and look in my direction, followed her. I frowned. Was Audrina annoyed I'd questioned her about giving Sally the bracelet? Or maybe she was just being Audrina, doing whatever she wanted to do without considering me at all. I entered the water alone, letting my body bob in the gentle waves created by the other swimmers, while tears pooled in my eyes. No matter how many times I told myself I wouldn't let my sister get to me, she did. Then I heard Max yell out, "Hey, B, we're over here," as he waved his hands in the air. I dunked underneath so I could clear my tears and swam over to him and Audrina. My sister grinned and splashed me with water, and I forcefully splashed her back. Audrina just laughed, and the edges around us softened, as they always did, even when I was sure they couldn't. We continued to play, eventually coming into the shallow water so Sally could join us too. For lunch, the four of us had a picnic next to the sandcastle Sally had made, munching on hot dogs and chips from the concession stand. "Is this the country?" Sally suddenly asked, while surveying the lake and its surroundings. "You mean the lake?" I replied. "Everything," she responded, waving her half-eaten hot dog in the air, and Audrina and I giggled. To us, country might have meant Stilk's farm about an hour's drive away, where our family went each fall to pick apples and pumpkins and visit the barn animals. It certainly didn't mean Deer Chase Lake or Route 108 or most of our town. Only later, when I started dating my husband, who lived in New York City, would I realize that all of Hammond was indeed quite rural and possibly country. "No, Sally," Max gently replied over our laughter, as Sally's eyes widened with embarrassment. "It's not the country, just a small town." Small town or not, the beach continued to fill up throughout the afternoon, the sounds and amount of people becoming almost overwhelming. Back in the lake, I began diving underwater and lingering there, enjoying the sudden hush that the sound barrier of the water provided. The only noises were a thin humming that seemed to come from the water itself, and the occasional bubble that would escape from my mouth. Every time I plunged underneath, it felt like the outside world was erased, and all that was left was me. The lake was murky, so I had to swim fairly blindly. Sometimes I bumped into another kid, at which point I would pop up and yelp a small "sorry" before disappearing again. It was during one of these accidental bumps and quick resurfacings that I realized people were exiting the lake. Everybody, in fact. It reminded me of when the lifeguards at the pool called for adult swim and the kids had to exit. I was momentarily disoriented. This wasn't the pool. And no lifeguard had blown a whistle. Or maybe they had, I realized as I sloshed toward the beach. I must not have heard it because I was underwater. There was a frantic energy in the air. Some parents were reaching for children and picking them up like they were toys. Others were whipping their heads left and right, frazzled. The older kids were running around or bundled in towels, hopping from foot to foot. Everyone was moving. It was as if we were all still swimming, but without any water. In the chaos, I struggled to locate Mrs. Baker. And then I saw her. I was surprised to find that even she was in motion, up from her chair, standing, looking, twisting. One of the lifeguards stood in front of her and was grabbing every little girl who ran by. "Mrs. Baker?" I asked as I approached. Her eyes just seemed to glaze over me. "Is this her?" the lifeguard asked, another confused girl momentarily captured in his arms. I suddenly felt sick, knots rolling in my stomach. A cool hand touched my back. "B," my sister said in a hoarse voice, "have you seen Sally?" I shook my head. "No." Mrs. Baker looked as white as I'd ever seen her, as if the inside of her arm where the sun didn't hit had spread like a rash. "I was swimming. Did she go swimming?" "I don't know," Audrina said. "I was swimming too, with Max. I saw her playing in the sand after we ate lunch." We both stared at the lake, now quiet, and it felt like time had momentarily paused. Then a lifeguard punctured the surface, breaking the stillness, to take a deep breath before disappearing again under the water. Max paced back and forth at the water's edge, his gaze scanning the lake. The water barrier was pierced again by an older teenage boy and another, and then by a man. And I realized that there were a lot of people blindly swimming underneath, looking for Sally. The sound of a siren boomed in the distance, and Audrina grabbed my hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much. So thank you both for the wonderful readings. Karen, you can come back and we can have both of you. Yeah. And Leanna, you can come back as well. Great. So there was a question. I think I've messed up my raised hand feature, but there was a question. And I think it was for Karen. And it was how different is your novel now from in other words, how many drafts has it gone through? How did you work to get where you are?
I went through so many drafts. I don't know how many drafts I went through. It took a long time, several years to write this novel, and there were several iterations. And, you know, I knew eventually where I wanted to land, but the journey there changed over the course of several years. And, you know, some characters became more important, some storylines. So it was a process.
So I'm just curious, just to follow up, how I mean, I know there's no way to measure it, but how different would you say it is from sort of the original, whenever you had that original idea, to where it is today?
Well, I started with some themes that I wanted to explore. So I wanted to explore sisters and secrets, and the idea that we're shaped by our actions, and sometimes our in the moment actions that seem inconsequential. And also I wanted to explore the ripple effects of tragedy, not only in these sisters, but in their neighborhood and small town. So I stayed true to those themes throughout my writing. In terms of how I got there, though, that shifted.
Okay, interesting. It's interesting to hear the themes, because you can hear them all in there, you know, sort of coming. Great. And let's see, there's another Q&A. Okay, but that seems like the one I just asked. Okay. So I also had a question. I had a question for Leanna, because it's so interesting. I love the way these things balance out in the readings, where the readers are different, but sort of connect. And, you know, yours is also about a daughter, for sure, and it's you. And it's so open. And I'm interested in sort of how you made a decision to write that way. And this may be more than you want to answer, but kind of how did you feel about sort of telling your father's story in telling your own story?
Yeah, I'm an open book, no pun intended, I suppose. I've known I wanted to write this book since I was 17 years old, and I first experienced my dad being sentenced for prison, and he was my best friend. And it was so tragic and hard to deal with. And I knew that there were a couple paths my life could take because of this event. And I just knew that I wanted to have a really strong relationship with my dad, and that I wanted to one day be able to say that, hey, I'm going to be one of those people that make it out of this way better than anyone could ever make it out, so that I can be an inspiration for people. That's what I wanted to do. So fast forward 12 years later, it wrote itself in a way, because my dad and I just had this amazing relationship, and I wanted to be able to share that in words.
I mean, it sounds like you've kind of been writing it for the last 12 years in some way or other. Have you actually been writing it, putting things down on paper or journaling, whatever, or did you sort of sit down and go whoosh and here it is?
Oh my gosh, no.
Okay.
I was even just asking Karen, I'm like, oh my gosh, the editing process. So I'm so glad you got asked that. I've been writing since I was 12. That was really when my dad started using or relapsing, and I did so in a private way. I never wrote because I thought people would read it, but writing has always been my expression to analyze how I'm actually feeling, being an only child and just not wanting to talk about these kinds of things to anyone. It took me a really long time to actually be able to tell my story. So it was private writing since I was 12 years old. But when it comes to writing the book, I started writing the book officially when I turned 25. So most of the chapters in my book come from blog posts I have written in the past, but just this past year, I've weaved them together to tell kind of a seamless story of our life together.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm just looking, it looks like, oh, I see. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm still getting used to the Q&A feature on this because we were using something other than Zoom. So it's a little past 7:30, which is kind of our end point. Does either of you have a question for the other person? Sometimes people do, but not necessary.
We chatted, I think, as Leanna mentioned, we exchanged a few emails. So we chatted about some writerly things during the past week.
Okay, great.
It does look like there's one person that asked another question, and I think it's kind of interesting. It says, if you could describe your book in 3 words, what are they?
Oh, wonderful. I can't, for some reason, I'm not getting that. So thank you very much. Does it say who it's for, or why don't you each answer it?
Yeah, it says for both of us.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
I would say forgiveness, love, and I guess this is not one word, but overcoming. What comes to mind?
That is a good question. I would say it's an emotional read, my book, nostalgic, because it takes place in the 1980s and there's a lot of 1980s references. And then I would say sisters, like complex sister and sibling dynamics and family dynamics.
Great. Thank you. That's a great question. Try to remember that question. So unless there's another question, as I said, we're sort of at our end point, and thank you both so much for reading. Again, they were sort of different, but in many ways seem to have some kind of themes in common. And a special thanks to the Writers Room Program Director, Leslie Ostro, who was doubling as our wonderful tech person tonight, keeping it going. Our next reading will be the 3rd Wednesday in October, October 19th, and we will have 2 former Writers Room fellows, Tori Weston and Shirley Luke. The announcement for the readings and any other writing room activities will be both on the website, Instagram, and Facebook. So we look forward to seeing you. We hope you all come back. Good night, and thank you all again, readers and listeners alike.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Take care.